Let's talk a little about civic education. That's the whole point of today's webinar, where our focus is on safeguarding our institutions through civic education. And, you know, as I mentioned in the opening, you are one of the key leaders on this. And just curious, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to explain to our audience, why do you care so much about this topic? It's clearly one that's important, but you've got a lot on your plate, and just curious what brings you to this topic so much.
Well, Matt, as you know, I spent a fair amount of time working with these fundamental documents like the Constitution and the laws of the land. As a judge, I was a state court judge for 13 years, 6 years on the trial bench, 7 years on the Texas Supreme Court before I became Attorney General. And so I spent a lot of time, especially as a judge, thinking about and writing about and studying the Constitution and understanding the difference in the laws as they apply to the state as opposed to the federal government, which is one of limited or delegated powers. And as you know, the Constitution is the fundamental law of the land, but I think many people don't understand that their rights are spelled out there. Our founders were pretty smart people when they set down, for example, in the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of association. Those are some fundamental things that are really, frankly, controversial these days. People want to be protected, especially in some of our liberal colleges and universities, want to be protected from opinions they disagree with. The founders would be shocked that we would engage in some kind of censorship to protect the tender ears of people who might be offended by controversy. As Louis Brandeis said at one point, he said, the solution for bad speech is more speech. In other words, we are, as a sovereign people, we are the ones who control the government, not the other way around. And the idea is, as spelled out in the Declaration of Independence and elsewhere, is one of popular sovereignty. In other words, our government gets its power from the bottom up, not from the top down. But given the polarization of our body politic and our news media and social media and the like, as well as, I might add, manipulation from outside sources, like Russia, for example, in the 2016 campaign, they were up to their old tricks and spreading a lot of disinformation and misinformation and hosting and nurturing conspiracy theories. So there's never been a time when we have needed more to get back to basics and to realize that we can't look to others to solve our problems. We have to look in the mirror, because we are the authority that we delegate then to our government, including our elected officials. But I would just close on one statistic. In 2019, the Annenberg Public Policy Center said that only about a third of the people that they polled could identify all three branches of government. They could only identify three branches of government, meaning 2/3 couldn't, and they certainly couldn't tell you what the differences were between those branches. And 22% said they couldn't name a single branch of government. So obviously we have some work cut out for us.
I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, coming from the judiciary world and the many years that you've been on that committee and the nominations that you see come across, I mean, imagine that there are folks who believe, continue to believe, that Judge Judy is on the Supreme Court. And that is a serious situation that we have here in this country, that we've got to get back to the basics. And I will say, David, just turning to you, when we talk about what you did last year as our visiting scholar and working with you over the past year on the Hatch report, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on and the conclusions that you felt that were the most relevant that you reached during that year-long process. And welcome back, David. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Matt. Senator, good to be with both of you. You're right, Matt, that in this report, we not only looked at the problem, I think increasingly there's an awareness that we're in a civic education crisis. Senator Cornyn mentioned a couple of evidences of that. One that I always turn to is the national testing that is done in civics and government. And in the most recent testing, only 24% of 8th graders were proficient, not outstanding, but proficient in civics and government, and only 15% in American history. That might be as clear an indicator as any that we have a serious problem. In fact, another study revealed that only a third of Americans could pass the US citizenship test, which is a test that immigrants pass at a 90% rate. So I think there's a growing awareness that we have a serious problem. And as you noted in your introduction, one of the things that we uncovered, I think, in the Hatch report is that this has a lot of downstream effects on our democracy. It undermines trust. How can you trust what you don't understand? So young people are losing trust in government and in politics. It causes a loss of voter turnout. It causes misunderstanding about our political and economic systems. Young people say they want socialism, but when you dig a little deeper, they don't even know what socialism is. That's really not what they want. So it has a lot of downstream effects, and we explored that in the Hatch report. We then turn to what could be done about it. And I think the good news is that we don't need one single huge solution to the problem. We don't have to have Washington come in and fix this for us. We don't have to wait for Bill Gates or Warren Buffett to invest billions of dollars to fix this, but everywhere from the family dinner table on up to Washington, there are things we can all do. I'll say in closing that I argued that the two maybe most important things that we should do in the next few years are, number one, have state governments, state legislatures increase the civics requirements in our schools. They have really declined over the last 40 years. You used to take several courses in that in the process of your education. Now, in most schools, there's only a single one-semester course in high school, and that's just not often enough, and it's not enough civics. And we'll talk about later, I'm sure, civics has largely been pushed out of the curriculum by STEM, by reading and math testing, by other priorities. So we need to restore the priority of civics and have it taught more often and more deeply in our schools. The second big thing that we felt needed to be done is to improve teacher education in civics. We have a lot of teachers in the classroom who are well-intentioned and want to do a great job, but they just haven't been properly prepared. And frankly, the federal government used to support teacher education in civics and stopped doing that about 10 years ago. So that's one of, again, several solutions. So those are the main two things. But as I said, from the dinner table on up, there's a lot to be done and a lot that can be done. That's the good news.
Thanks, David. We will definitely get back to some of those issues you raised, but I want to stay on Senator Cornyn's bill, the Civic Secures Democracy Act. You've been working with a great bipartisan group on this legislation. I don't believe that bipartisanship is a swear word. We embrace that, and we applaud you for being involved with Senator Coons and Representatives DeLauro and Representative Cole in pushing forward this legislation. It's always been, it seems to, from my viewpoint, that civic education has been one of those low-hanging fruits where it's always been bipartisan. But it seems that something is changing over these past couple of years, and it seems like there's either a divergence of opinion or whatever it may be, but it's changing where it's become a little more partisan. And if not a little more, it's been pretty partisan on many topics. I'm just curious, Senator, how do we keep it from becoming too politicized? Because it's too important for it to be caught up in the partisanship.
Well, I agree with that. And I think David made the point that we're not seeking for the federal government to take over K through 12 education, but we do need some support for our states, which are, to quote Louis Brandeis again, the laboratories of democracy, and hopefully can come in with some curriculum requirements and other things that will then be tested in that laboratory, and then will be followed by other states seeking to follow the best practices. the Civics Secures Democracy Act would authorize $785 million in grants to state education agencies and nonprofit organizations to expand access to civic education for students. Much of my experience with the James Madison Foundation, which I believe Senator Hatch was one of the co-founders of, I was chairman of that for a while. We focused primarily on teaching the teachers, as David suggested, to make sure that middle and secondary school teachers, they were familiar with the founding documents, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution itself, the Federalist Papers. And so they can take that fundamental knowledge back to their classrooms and engage their students in a way that will be appealing to them and which will help them understand the best way to deal with their frustration and confusion about what's happening in public life is to engage in it and engage in those debates. I have to tell you, my own development is, in terms of what I truly believe in, was not really accomplished until I actually got involved in debating various controversial points. It's amazing how much that helps you crystallize your thinking, but also makes you better at defending your values and principles, and occasionally, just occasionally, changing my mind when I listened to the other arguments on the other side, which is not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign that you are actually listening, which we don't do enough of anymore, and willing to change your mind with new and different information. I just have to add that in closing to this question is, there is a huge need and hunger out across America, I believe, for what we're talking about today. Senator Lamar Alexander, the former Secretary of Education and a former colleague of Senator Hatch's and mine, he told me one time, he said, if you want a guaranteed applause line at your next town hall, just say this: we need to return the teaching of civics and history to our classrooms so every child can grow up knowing what it means to be an American. He said that's a guaranteed applause line. And I really think because it resonates so much with what people sense is missing in their own children and in our classrooms today.
That's beautifully said. Thank you, Senator. And Senator Lamar Alexander, one of the true gentlemen of the Senate. Thank you for bringing that up. David, talking a little about the civics landscape, Senator Cornyn touched a little about this, but I want to drill down with you. When he talked about what we're seeing across the country, you seem to be much more across the country in the trenches of civics focused, and you seem to know the pulse of the civics landscape across the country. What are you seeing out there, and what can we learn from some of the pressure points?
Well, I see good news and bad news, which I guess is not surprising. I think the good news is we see a lot more conversation and attention about civics education. As I said, it's almost becoming conventional wisdom that we have a major problem in civics and we need to address it. So just a few quick data points, Matt. I mean, this summer, actually in the spring, was released a major national study, a roadmap that was put together by 300 scholars supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities to try to get down to the level of curriculum and to try to give school districts some guidance and teachers some guidance on how to take curriculum for civic education from kindergarten right on through high school education. Now, I don't agree with all of it. And frankly, whenever you get scholars involved, we don't always come up with the most pragmatic, workable solutions. They're a little bit complicated, I think. And there's a little bit of a sense of scholars trying to build their own ideal world using civic education as a tool rather than just improving civics for its own sake. So, but it's a worthwhile conversation and it's a worthwhile study. Then the Fordham Institute very recently came up with a study of the state of civic education, especially the planning and curriculum side in all 50 states in America. And that's kind of fun to look at to see where your state, falls and whether you've got an excellent plan for teaching civics or whether you do not. Frankly, there were more problems than there were stars in the firmament, but a lot of states are moving forward. So, those are a couple of interesting major national studies that we hadn't seen in quite a while. Lots of action, as Senator Cornyn mentioned, in Washington to try to re-engage. Washington used to fund civic education, especially teacher training, but stopped doing that about 10 years ago. And so I think this bill that Senator Cornyn and others are sponsored is kind of bringing Washington potentially back into the game. And one of the things, frankly, we need from Washington is a strong rallying cry that civics is important. And I think this bill would help make that statement. Then we have in state capitals kind of a mixed bag. The state capitals have kind of gotten drawn into the political side, if you will, of civic education. So the majority of states have actually been looking at in recent months bills to ban the teaching of certain approaches to history and civics. Critical race theory being the primary one, the 1619 project about slavery, another one, action civics, which we may talk about later, being another one. So again, in my view, it's probably not the best use of state legislative time, but we've got a lot of state legislatures. 26 of them have been debating bills to ban particular approaches to teaching history and civics. 11 of them have passed those bills. So that's taken up a lot of time. But meanwhile, if I may say on the more constructive side, New Jersey has passed a bill requiring civics in middle school, which I think is really important. We can't wait till high school. Florida has passed a bill requiring the teaching of primary documents in civics, which I think is a best practice. Rhode Island had been one of the few holdout states that had no civic ed requirement. So they have now passed a civic ed requirement. So we see in the state legislatures a fair amount of at least conversation down the civics road. So it's a big topic now. Although, as I said, there's always the danger in this hyper-partisan political world we live in. Thomas Mann, the writer, said everything is politics. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that there's a politics of civics and history.
Well, I'm hoping that we can actually squeeze some of the lemonade out of those lemons that you brought up, and hopefully we can keep the focus on civics.
Right.
And that's what I'm hoping. The optimist in me hopes that that's where we're headed.
Right.
Senator Cornyn, in Texas, obviously, Texas is a huge hub for the tech sector. And likewise, Utah, back in Utah, we have the Silicon Slopes. So we care very much about the science, technology, engineering, mathematics students. But what we discovered in our report last year, and I'm sure this isn't news to you, that there was an extreme disparity. When we're talking extreme between the STEM students and the civics students, we're talking $54 to 5 cents in civics education. So the pendulum has swung so much to, and it is a juggernaut to most of our economies. We want the tech sector to thrive. We want them to be able to find those folks who are skilled. However, it seems now that it is so much in favor of only STEM students. We've got to break that mold. I mean, at least throw some additional dollars. We're talking cents. What are your thoughts on that, and how do we overcome that disparity?
Well, the focus on STEM is one that has been a long-standing priority for the country, and we all understand the importance of people understanding science, technology, engineering, math. And these are the jobs of not only today, but of the future. But we don't have to choose between the humanities and between civics and technology studies, because we need both. We don't want to produce a nation of technocrats or people that are capable of working on let's say a manufacturing line and dealing with their widget, but not really understanding anything else about the process or about self-government. This really is about the fundamental notion of popular sovereignty, that the legitimacy of our government depends on the consent of the governed. The alternative is an authoritarian model, socialism, as David mentioned, and others seems to have gotten a little bit of a resurgence, mainly because people don't understand what it means and understand that it implies a level of coercion if you don't comply with the program. So I think, you know, we've been through this kind of wilderness period here, where I'm glad to hear the report that David just gave about some of what's happening at the state level. He's right. In Texas, for example, there's been a big debate over critical race theory, and you know, that is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And I think we need to focus on the whole challenge. Not the job of education is not to teach you what to think, it's to teach you how to think. And to me, that's the fundamental difference.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Senator. David, back in Utah, the Sutherland Institute is one of our partners on civics, and they recently launched an initiative to focus on teaching civics at a grassroots level, and they're doing a great job at that. I know that you also are of the opinion that revitalizing our institutions starts in the classroom. So how can we build a national movement toward civic education, more in the grassroots, much akin to what the Sutherland Institute has done in Utah, taking it to the national level?
Yeah, to me, that might be the single most important thing we could do, Matt, is to build a national movement toward civics. You know, we got in the 50s, we got scared because Russia sent Sputnik into outer space and was the first, you know, to reach outer space with a flight. And we stirred up our math and science education as a result. And then in the 80s, we had a nation at risk report that showed how far behind we were on some of the international comparisons of educational testing. And so we had another sort of reform. So we are, as a nation, we are capable of getting stirred up about education and emphasizing it. And that, in my view, that might be the most valuable thing we can do, is to get the country top to bottom stirred up. So I go back, as a starting point, I go back to Ronald Reagan's closing address as president. And basically the last thing he said in his last address was that he thought America was falling down on teaching and sharing our system and our values to the next generation. And he called for Americans around the dinner table to share the lessons of our democracy and the importance of our democracy. And he called it, and I think this is a great goal, he called it, quote, an informed patriotism, unquote. To me, that's ultimately the goal of civic education, is an informed patriotism. So that does start at the dinner table, and it starts with parents, you know, getting a reading list and talking to their kids about things that are important. It moves to, I think, civic organizations in a community, sponsoring Constitution giveaways, sponsoring oratory and speech contests that pertain to founding documents. It's obviously spreads to the schools. We'll continue to talk about the importance of that being not just a one-course high school emphasis, but starts in kindergarten and goes throughout your education. It stretches to our colleges and beyond. It stretches to state capitals. It stretches to Washington. So that's what I think we really need in this country. And I think every level, as I said, from the dining room table to the Optimist Club and Rotary Club to schools and to governments, everybody's got an oar in that water, or should have. And then that's what we most need. I think we most need a national movement that civics is really worth emphasizing. And if we save our democracy, it may be the single most important leverage point we have.
Senator, do you have anything you want to add to that? That was a pretty loaded and very good response, David, but wondered if the senator wanted to add to that.
Well, David was giving me flashbacks to my high school Optimist oratorical contest that my dad, he was a member of a local Optimist club, and encouraged me to participate. And of course, I was terrified. The idea of speaking in front of a group, much less competing against my peers. But I think that's exactly right. Those sorts of grassroots or, you know, foundational organizations that de Tocqueville talked about, our voluntary associations being one of the unique features of our democracy, and it can have a build momentum of its own and affect public policy makers and change things. To David's point as well, we've done this before. You know, the reason why we spend so much money on STEM to the detriment of civics education is because we saw that as a threat. And we did something about it. But again, maybe this is a little bit of a, you know, there's nothing new around here. It just seems to cycle through from time to time. But, you know, I would say it also would involve creative people. I know this sounds kind of silly, but I still tell people sometimes you might want to go back and search on the internet this this thing called Schoolhouse Rock. You know, starts with I'm a Bill, I'm sitting on Capitol Hill, and takes you through the legislative process. And so there are ways to teach the fundamentals of civics and self-government and the legislative process at all levels. But there's also a role for creative people who could do things in memorable ways that we will remember after all these years, like I have when I first saw that.
Wonderful. I want to stay on this this topic about the states, and I guess where I'm at, and I'm sure you would agree, Senator, and I know David would. The solution can't be at the federal level just throwing money at the problem, right? There's got to be this partnership between the federal government and, most important, with the state and local governments pushing this forward if we're going to be successful. I don't think, and I would hope you would agree, the solution can't always be that. Let's just, you know, throw money and it will go away. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. And then to David, how do we make sure that it's much more than that, that we really hopefully spur that level of engagement at the state and local level?
Well, just as a matter of prudence, I think it's a bad idea to experiment at the national level on laws that affect 330 plus million people. That's why the Brandeis formulation of laboratories of democracy and the federal form of government we have as opposed to a national form of government is one of our great strengths because the states can experiment, they can try new and different things and see if they work. And if they do, then you could scale them up. But the one thing the federal government does have is money because it has the taxation power. And but there's always the temptation to think that Washington knows best, or that somehow people get smarter when they leave their hometowns all across this great country and come to the nation's capital. All of a sudden, they've got the single answer. And if people were just smart enough to listen to them and accept what they are saying, then the world would be a better place. I just think that's a mistake. They have that entirely backwards. And so the federal government will continue to provide money for, and should, I think, for some of these grant programs that help at the local and state level, but we shouldn't try to replace it.
David.
I'm in complete agreement with the senator on states as labs of experimentation, and I think it applies very strongly to civics. If we knew the best way to teach civics, it's certainly not coming out in the results at the moment. And so we really need to learn how to teach civics more effectively, and we need to look at different models. So, for example, I'd like to see states looking at requiring civics in the elementary grades. Most elementary schools simply do not teach civics anymore. And there are some things you can teach about patriotism and civics in kindergarten, for crying out loud. And so some states have led the way in saying that in each grade level, there are certain things that kids could be learning, starting right in kindergarten. And so we expect this in kindergarten, and we expect this in first grade, and so forth. I'd love to see more states looking at some models of that, and some states have already led the way on that. Then in middle school, Florida, for example, has led the way, and some other states are beginning to follow on a required middle school course in civics, not waiting until high school. My own view is that the gold standard, even in high school, would be a full year of civics, not just one semester. And we have a long way to go before states could approach that, and that's not going to be easy to do. I'm not the greatest fan of testing in K-12 education, but we have a testing culture now. And so if you test everything but not civics, that sort of gives a message. So, and the research does show that when you test something like civics in high school, it does improve learning and retention. And so a number of states have moved toward testing graduation requirement in high school for civics. States probably want to look at something of that sort. I mentioned earlier, there are some great teaching techniques. Senator Cornyn mentioned the Schoolhouse Rock video, and iCivics, founded by Sandra Day O'Connor, has led the way in creating a lot of kind of civics games and clever approaches, more memorable to students and how they learn. I'm a huge fan of primary documents for teaching history and civics. And I've been involved with the Ashbrook Center, which retrains thousands of teachers to teach using not textbooks, which frankly generally range from boring to biased, and just take students right back to the debates and the documents of the time and let them draw their own conclusions from those things rather than the conclusion of the teacher or the textbook. So we're learning a lot of things that work, and I'd love to see state legislatures just one after another digging in and starting their own experiments, following the best practices as they're now beginning to emerge, I think, from certain states.
That's great, David. I'm very mindful of not only the busy schedule that's waiting Senator Cornyn there here in Washington, but I also am very mindful of those who get Zoom fatigue. We've all learned this in the pandemic era, that there's only a certain amount of time that folks just start glazing over on Zoom. So here's what I want to do. I want to do a quick rapid fire, starting with you, David, and give the senator the last word. In a sentence or two, how would you describe the thesis of your book that's coming out on civics?
Well, our book is called The Civic Education Crisis. And I think we want to build a common understanding that there is a crisis and how we got here and what we need to do to solve it. And to my surprise, there is no book out there really about that. And so we're trying to build a broad awareness that we are in a crisis and how we got to the crisis and what we must do about it. And so it will come out next year.
Next
Pardon?
year?
Next year.
Next year.
Next fall, about a year.
Excellent. We'll keep an eye open for it. And Senator Cornyn, back to your bill where we began. If your bill, we hope, is enacted in some form or another, which we believe will improve civic education across the country, is that one and done, or what would the world look like after that bill?
Well, I don't think it's one and done because, Matt, self-government is not for sissies. And it's also it's a continual debate, as you know, having worked here in the Senate. This is where the ideas, good, bad, and the ugly, get debated in Congress. And there's one institution where that opportunity for debate is as fulsome as it can possibly be, and that's the U.S. Senate. And so we need to talk about these ideas. We need to engage our constituents. We need to engage experts and get the best advice we can. But again, I don't think the template or game plan should emanate from Washington. I think the best thing we can do is empower some of the great initiatives that are taking place. David mentioned it's kind of encouraging to me to hear how many states are undertaking this newfound interest in civics education, doing something about it. I think that's where this should happen. But certainly we're open to new ideas from the Hatch Foundation or from David or anyone who has other ideas about what we ought to do. It's amazing to me that actually this bill got a little bit controversial at the beginning because people had a lot of skepticism about what we were trying to accomplish. They thought we were trying to weigh in on things like critical race theory and other controversial things. I have my own views about that. I'm gonna bore you with here, but it's much more foundational than that. And we shouldn't let the shiny objects and the controversial points just distract us from the fundamental equipping of our citizenry with the tools they need in order to control and govern ourselves.
Well, that's beautifully said. And with that, we'll bring today's symposium to a close. And once again, we'd like to thank Senator Cornyn, David Davenport for sharing their insights and spending some time with us. I hope folks realize what this means when you have someone like Senator Cornyn taking time from his schedule and someone like David Davenport joining us to talk about something as critical as civic education. It's just an honor. We're grateful for you. We're grateful that you take some time. And as many of you know who are listening, the mission of the Hatch Foundation, let me just repeat it, is to promote civility and solutions to the nation's most pressing problems. And it's fair today that today's discussion brought us one step closer. So with that, we hope you enjoyed today's symposium and that you'll consider joining us for future events. Until then, be safe and be well. Have a good day.